pretty sure Clint Eastwood didn't dub his own dialogue with a cigarillo in his mouth. The Italian and German discs on one side, the Kino Disc on the other side, and me right in the middle. Crazy bell ringer was right. There's a lot of money to be made in this town. See, Leone fans don't like releases getting screwed up. They get the crazy idea you're screwing with them. Now, if you make this release right like I know you're going to, I might be able to convince him that you really didn't mean it. Awful hard to like something when there's so many compromises in the release.
Okay, enough of that. Hello and welcome back to this Damn Dualistic Crusade. This video is my review of Kino Lorber's new 4K and Blu-ray combo pack release of A Fistful of Dollars. It was released concurrently this year with their release of For a Few Dollars More, finally bringing the iconic Dollars trilogy films directed by Sergio Leone to the new 4K UHD realm. And the hope has been since their announcement that the other two Dollars films would get the same treatment. Ironically, the same treatment as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly did with Kino's 4K release, which did finally use fan historian and fan preservation efforts to try and rework the Richard Vada master MGM had commissioned into something that was thankfully finally much more of an archival release that I praised quite a bit in my review of it. And so myself and other Leone fans have been waiting with bated breath for these new releases. Unfortunately, I can't say that that lightning has struck for a second and third time, because as is always the case with Leone's films on home video, there is no perfect release to date, unfortunately, for any of them, and these are no exception. I think it's going to be up to the individual fan or fan of Leone's work or fan of these films to decide on which release is going to be best for them, and I hope that I can cover all the important points to try to enlighten as much as possible. Now, Fistful of Dollars has not had the same technical amount of problems as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in terms of its edit, and the same thing, it hasn't had as many editing issues as For a Few Dollars More, which has missing footage, which partially has been, or mostly has been reinstated for the new Kino release. So there are no concerns there. The primary concerns are to deal with the color grading of this new master, which has been addressed to some degree in this new release, and the audio, which is a brand new remix of different original elements done as part of this restoration that has a great number of issues of its own. And by and large, this disc is essentially the same thing we saw from Kino's other previous Blu-ray release, just with adjustments made to the color timing and a UHD presentation in SDR. So essentially, what you're getting in this release over the previous Kino release is thankfully a major adjustment in the color timing, which was pretty atrocious in the last disc. It had a lot of the problems that the only films have had in the more modern era. And you're getting this bump to 4K on the UHD presentation. And outside of that, that is pretty much the actual contents of what you're getting. The extras package is the same, but it's all on the Blu-ray disc, and it is the same base master and audio. Now, to talk about the film, I think it's quite common now for people to just sort of treat essentially the entirety of the Dollars trilogy, but especially the first two films, and perhaps Fistful of Dollars most of all, as simply a sort of old standard and a bit simplistic compared to the films that followed, especially The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is the most famous and most widely seen of the three. And since this was really only Leone's second directorial feature after Colossus of Rhodes, and it had an extremely low budget of only $200,000 and had issues in the production because the budget was so low, and especially because of the Yojimbo connection, I think the common tendency is for people to just sort of gloss over A Fistful of Dollars and not recognize that it is really the starting point for everything Sergio Leone would do in his later films, everything the Dollars trilogy would do, but it is the sort of clarion call for the Italian Western, which had existed before this point, but it had never crystallized, and as many of the historians have said, into a Western with a distinct Italian flavor. Essentially, Fistful of Dollars is the building block without which you would not have the entirety of Sergio Leone's career, and it is so full of rich textures and a certain cynicism that really defines the Dollars trilogy and Italian westerns to come that are unique. And it also is already showing of Leone's undying love of the Western genre and how he wanted to bring the legends back to life for himself and others, but also in a way that was a bit more realistic and could apply their inherent cynicism about how things were in the real world and how that, especially Italy in the post-war period at this time, that the Italian cinema audience wanted to be entertained and they themselves were a bit cynical, so you had to really push the envelope to hit home with them and achieve an actual entertainment factor. So there's that sense of having to work for your audience as well. But it's this notion of Leone loving Westerns so much, but wanting to add a little bit of a dangerous element back to the Western, but also a sort of casual flippancy that I think is rightly tied by Sir Christopher Frayling and others, that is very rightly tied to the explosion of James Bond with Dr. No in 1962. And I do think you can sort of draw a line of that sort of that casual flippancy, that inherent cynicism from the early Bond films, particularly the Terence Young original 2 films, also other films like The Guns of Navarone from 1961, and of course bits of Yojimbo as well, that are going into this cauldron. But it's Leone getting to display his talents at full blast for the first time, really. I do think you get a good sense of Leone in Colossus of Rhodes, but it is an entirely different kind of film. And this is a film that Leone himself was dying to make. It was Leone himself who came up with the idea of Yojimbo being a great idea to remake as a Western. And of course, he was not the first person to think of or even remake a Kurosawa classic masterpiece as a Western. Most famously, in 1960, John Sturges would do this in The Magnificent Seven. So, of course, there was already a great precedent, and The Magnificent Seven was a huge smash success in Italy and helped turn many of the faces in the film into giant stars overnight and throughout all of Europe. It's this quality that Leone brought, this heart and soul he put into the film, along with the first absolutely just true experience of his artistic genius and the core elements of what would become his style, from everything like the score of Ennio Morricone to the production design, the incredible production design of Carlo Simi, to the use of the Techniscope process, which allowed him to develop his intensive close-ups and his wide vista shots simply due to the nature of the Techniscope 2-perf system. All of these are on display for the first time. Again, Colossus of Rhodes is maybe his apprenticeship picture in terms of he's trying out a few things, but it's still a completely different type of film, being a peplum, a historical sword and sandal type film. You get flashes of the Leone style and the Leone energy, but it isn't until Fistful of Dollars where everything is laid bare, which is why it really pains me that so many label it as a ripoff of Kurosawa's Yojimbo. It was a remake. It is still debated on why the rights were not actually gotten from Kurosawa. It is generally held that when you read Frayling's biography of Leone, and you read as much as you can, again, it is not entirely known for sure, but it is most likely due to the fact that the film had a very low budget, and the producers were not the most scrupulous and not necessarily the most honest, it seems, because after the film was a gigantic success in Italy and broke box office records that Leone was not paid his proper salary and wound up suing and then leaving the said producers. So I think it definitely is probably some sort of machinations like that. Like they just didn't want to pay for the rights because they didn't think it was going to make much money. But it was always a remake of Yojimbo. It does borrow a lot from Yojimbo because it is a remake. The standard story itself is, of course, much older than Yojimbo. You can trace it all the way back to historical plays. You could even link the idea of one party playing two factions against each other, all the way back perhaps to even Shakespeare. But the best reference is, of course, before Yojimbo as well, which is Dashiell Hammett's first masterpiece novel, 1929's Red Harvest, where the nameless Continental op detective finds himself in the town of Poisonville and is essentially having to pit crime factions against each other. So while it is very different, the basic structure you can trace back to, at the very least, to Dashiell Hammett's first novel. Essentially what I'm trying to say is I just get very tired of a great number of people labeling the film as a rehash or a ripoff of Yojimbo, simply due to the fact that the rights were not purchased by the producers. However, everything worked out very well for Kurosawa, who got the Japanese distribution rights and wound up making more money off of A Fistful of Dollars than he had ever made off of any of his own films. So Kurosawa made quite a nice bundle, maybe a fistful of yen. Terrible pun, I know. Anyway, everything turned out well for everyone. But the identity of A Fistful of Dollars is so totally different. The intensity, the tone, the even the level of violence in some ways, but the energy is totally different. That's why I think it is extremely unfair to label the film as simply rehashing or ripping off Yojimbo. It is a remake, just as The Magnificent Seven was a remake of The Seven Samurai. It has just as distinct, in fact, I'd argue it has an even more distinct identity compared to the Kurosawa original than Magnificent Seven does to Seven Samurai. And those two films are very different. So I don't think you can simply label A Fistful of Dollars as a rehashing of Yojimbo, because the identity is totally different. And this was also really groundbreaking, even though it wasn't seen here in the U.S. until 1966-67, due to the rights holdup, and then United Artists purchasing the rights to the first $2 films in addition to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. When this was made, there had been gritty and darker and violent westerns made, but they were still mostly tied into the studio system. And there had been European and even Italian westerns made, but they had not really done anything other than just try and imitate American films, which is why the initial prints of Fistful of Dollars credited everyone, including Leone himself, with Americanized sounding names. Bob Robertson was the director of A Fistful of Dollars on all the original release prints until they started retitling it with everybody's real names. This also did not have a great reputation. No one thought they were making high art. Probably not anyone except Leone and his key crew members. And of course, with the low budget, Leone could not get the type of American star he so wanted. He wanted to get some of the Western icons and people that he absolutely adored, who would not take a second glance at a terribly translated script that would show up on their doorstep with a pitiful small amount of money compared to what their normal salary rates were. So this is how we wound up with Clint Eastwood when he was still in his Rawhide days. So he was a television star as Rowdy Yates on Rawhide, and for simply the decision of a whim, essentially, of getting $15,000 during the summer break between Rawhide seasons to go and just make this movie in Italy and at least get a vacation out of it and see some sights and maybe try and have some fun with it. that was the whole impetus for Clint Eastwood going to Italy to make A Fistful of Dollars. And of course, Eastwood himself was a Kurosawa fan and recognized and saw, oh, I love Yojimbo. This is a cool idea as a Western. So there's this really interesting falling into place of all of the various elements that would define the Dollars trilogy in both cast and crew, and all in this little film that wasn't supposed to be much of anything and only had a $200,000 budget. And in fact, the budget was so low, the main set was actually being reused. It was a previously standing Western set, but it is entirely due to Leone and the production design of Carlos Simi of transforming that standing set into the town of San Miguel, that it feels like a real place, like you have transported yourself into this world where things are not like how they are in the conventional Hollywood Western, where the hero, the supposed hero, acts like a villain most of the time and has this sort of detached, laconic, cynical humor that's also a sort of not necessarily a defense mechanism, but a means of expressing his internal monologue. Because otherwise, the man with no name, as he's called in the by the United Artists campaign, even though he has a name in all three films, if you pay attention. Here, of course, he is Joe. Which, of course, is probably just a name that the coffin maker just comes up with. It's probably not really his name. Or, of course, it's so obviously an alias that he maybe doesn't actually have a name. This world is filled with characters like this, and they are all so fully realized, even if they are built out of iconic Western figures that you would know if you were well-versed in the genre. You've never quite seen them like this before. You've never seen a Western with this level of ironic detachment and this sense of playing around with the form a little bit and having a little dash of being self-aware. You see this in the other Dollars films, especially for A Few Dollars More. And when you look at the first two Dollars films, they have a different identity. Maybe you could say they have a little bit more of a particularly Italian or European flavor to them. They're much tighter because of their runtimes being shorter, but never as much as in A Fistful of Dollars. This is only an hour and 40 minutes, really. It's a very tight narrative. It's very simple on the surface, but that simplicity is disguising the fact that the rest of the film, all the characters and the interplay and the spaces, the silence, the soundtrack, of course, the visuals, the photography, the intensive close-ups, and, of course, Morricone's score are so deeply and richly textured that, again, the film itself becomes an experience and is really the first true Sergio Leone experience. And never again would he make another film that had this level of focus. He becomes more confident on the next film, For a Few Dollars More, which is, for my money, the best of the Dollars trilogy, because it has the best of both the films that precede it and succeed it. But in that film, you get the sense of him stretching out a little bit and being more confident. Has a longer runtime, and he's starting to play with the passage of time more. And it's the first film that he does that has a major flashback in it. Fistful of Dollars has none of that. So, of all of Leone's Westerns, A Fistful of Dollars is the tightest, the leanest, and perhaps the meanest in ways. And that gives it a unique identity, along with the shorter runtime. This one has a great sense of that flippancy, that deep cynicism, and has a extraordinarily strong flavor of it being an Italian Western, and that is what made it so unique. That's what made it a runaway hit in Italy, because there had never been anything like this before. And it started to influence others, and since it was also a German and Spanish co-production, that helped to influence not just Italian Westerns to have a boom, but other countries to start making Westerns of their own. And then this eventually started to trickle back over to the US when we finally got all three films released by the end of 1967. So it took a little while, but it started to trickle over, and then you eventually started having American films kind of imitate things from the Italian films, so it was a full circle type thing. You see that most notably when Clint Eastwood came back to the U.S. and made his first Western post-Leone, which of course was 1968's Hang 'em High, which does have specific moments that do harken back to Leone and do absolutely feel like they're taken out of an Italian Western. That's not to say A Fistful of Dollars wasn't influenced by American classic Hollywood Westerns, because Leone couldn't help but do that. There were some certain select Westerns that sort of prefaced what Leone would do with this film and what would become known as the Italian Western style, with this greater degree of cynicism and realism and grittiness and earthiness. And I think chief among those, one of Leone's absolute favorite films that he referenced time and time again, of course, would be 1954's Robert Aldrich directed Veracruz, which Leone specifically references in For a Few Dollars More and Once Upon a Time in the West. But it is the flavor you see in this film and certain other select westerns of the 1950s, like elements of the Bud Bodeker, Randolph Scott westerns, elements of the Anthony Mann, James Stewart westerns, and many other of the psychological westerns of the 1950s. Those you really feel as the undercurrent of what Leone was doing, along with, of course, great doses of John Ford. But there was never anything in a John Ford film that was in any way, shape, or fashion as cynical and as unbelievably gritty as it would be realized by Sergio Leone in one of his westerns. In short, there had never quite been anything like A Fistful of Dollars in the entirety of the western genre. It was both a love letter to the western and a sort of slight rebuke to how the western had sort of gotten almost a little bit stodgy in feeling in various places, or in a way trying to wake audiences up to what a Western could be and the strengths of the genre, and reminding people of what they loved in Westerns while making it a bit more gritty and a bit more alive, and of course much more cynical to befit a 1960s Italian audience. I would be remiss if I didn't mention, once again, the amazing production design of Carlo Simi, the cinematography of Massimo Dellamano, who shot the first two of the Dollars films for Leone, and helped to develop the visual style Leone is so associated with, that really just explodes in this film. You get a flash or two of it, again, in Colossus of Rhodes, but here in Fistful of Dollars, Leone was working with Techniscope for the first time, which was the 2-perf process that squeezed 2 widescreen scope-sized frames within a normal 4-perf frame of film stock, which meant you used half the amount of raw film stock. That meant your film costs were cut in half, so you could save half your budget of what you would normally spend on film stock, which is why it was called the poor man's CinemaScope. It was a process developed by Technicolor in Italy. It was used on a lot of European films and some films in the US and in the UK, usually ones on a lower budget, and it would have to have an optical conversion process and be converted to a normal print, a normal 4-perf print, I should say. This could either be done well or not well, but with digital tools today, you can extract an absolutely remarkable image from original Techniscope negatives without having to go through that extra optical process step of converting the actual negative over to a standard print. But this meant you could have a razor-sharp focus scope-sized image without having to use anamorphic lenses. So that meant you could get these really intensive, very close close-ups that you couldn't do in normal CinemaScope because an anamorphic lens didn't work that way. And it also meant you could get these amazing wide shots, again, in perfect focus. And it was on this film where it was found that using these extreme images and then alternating the two, you see the Leone style coming alive right in front of your eyes, and the key crew members help to facilitate this. And so the film kind of becomes the little film that nobody had any hopes for, that becomes lightning in a bottle, and that is A Fistful of Dollars' best description. It is lightning in a bottle. And Eastwood himself becomes an icon just immediately. He would not have the overnight success in the U.S. immediately that he did in all of Europe, and especially in Italy, because by the time of the second film, he was a star who would be mobbed in the streets. It would take, really until the late end of the 1960s, early 1970s for him to hit that level of stardom in the U.S., but Eastwood is absolutely iconic as Joe the Stranger, or the Man with No Name, whatever you want to use, in A Fistful of Dollars. I do think he is really evenly matched by the incredible Jean Maria Volonté as the head villain, Ramon, head of the Rojo clan. The film is peppered with all these different great faces from German actors and Spanish actors and Italian actors, who are all, of course, speaking their own languages on the film set, and all of the release mixes were dubbed, as were all Italian films. But I have to mention Volante's performance, which is so larger than life, and he had an incredible theatrical background. And of course, he would return in the sequel, the follow-up, for a few dollars more, as the villain Indio, in an even bigger performance. This is also the first glimpse of the sort of Leone stock company, because you see all these great faces of these actors and these extras that Leone loved so much that he would reuse them in different parts again and again and again, just like his heroes, especially John Ford, who famously had his own stock company of favorite actors and actresses. So you will see the same faces pop up time and time again, but in different fashions or in completely different characters, which is a really nice switch. And then, of course, there is Ennio Morricone's score, which is, even though it is the first of the scores and it's not a particularly long score, it is the first collaboration with Leone, and their partnership is legendary in film scoring. It is one of the all-time great, iconic composer-director partnerships. They spoke each other's language. They complemented each other's work so brilliantly that it seemed that they were simply made to go together. There is no one without the other. They were that unified. And just like the film itself, Morricone's score is not as elaborate as what would come later, but it fits the film perfectly. It has a specific focus. It is cued very specifically. Again, it's not a very long score, but the cues themselves live on in your memory forever after seeing the film. They are just burned into your brain, along with the visuals of the intensity of the close-ups and Leone's personal visual style. So you cannot talk about A Fistful of Dollars without talking about the visuals, the production design, the flippant, cynical style, the love of the Western genre, the energy Leone put into everything, but also the score of Ennio Morricone. All of these elements come together for the first time in A Fistful of Dollars, and it is the foundation of Leone's cinematic career in all creative aspects. This is where everything comes together. This is the lightning in a bottle moment, and it's not as developed or as textured or as elaborate as what would come later. But without this film, you wouldn't have anything afterwards. So that's my little spiel on A Fistful of Dollars, which, of course, like any Leone fan, I am obsessed with. It should be pretty obvious by my little fistful display I tried to put together. I fit most everything I have fistful related behind me. Not quite everything. I couldn't fit another Laserdisc box set because I have the trilogy box as well. I could fit that behind me too. But I'm, of course, biased. I am absolutely obsessed with all of Leone's films, and I hate the fact that the first two films of the Dollars trilogy sort of get overlooked by the more famous third film, but especially Fistful, because it is the simplest and it is a Yojimbo remake, and the story has been redone in various other ways, and there was the Last Man Standing film in 1995. It sort of gets glossed over, and people lose sight of just how important it was in 1964, and how it is the birth of everything people think of when they think of these films or Sergio Leone. It is his first tried and true film where, you can feel his name is on it. And of course, it's ironic that eventually, once the film became really successful, they did actually put his name on it. So it's very much the same sense where Hitchcock would talk about he had made films, but it wasn't until he made The Lodger that he felt he had made his first true Hitchcock picture, the type of movie he wanted to make, that he could feel comfortable as talking about as something he made that had his name on it. So I think you get that here as well, although I really adore Colossus of Rhodes. It's a truly underrated film that is so needing to be seen by people, because there's even a lot of Sergio Leone fans who love the Westerns but have never actually gone back and seen Colossus of Rhodes, which is really important. You can see some little flashes of what just explodes all over the screen in A Fistful of Dollars. So that's why I think that film is incredibly important and a heck of a lot of fun. But you can definitely tell, that it was not a project that necessarily originated with Leone, whereas this film did in its entirety. So let us travel through the ghost town of San Miguel and get to what we're all here for, which is the new Kino Lorber 4K Blu-ray combo release. So here we have the new Kino release, which, like their previous Blu-ray, uses the original US one-sheet art, sized down for a Blu-ray case. This original first pressing comes with the lovely slipcover that is the same thing we got on their The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly release that quickly sold out. So I know there are a lot of fans who really love the slipcovers, so you do have to get these sooner rather than later because they do sell out of and stop making the slipcovers very quickly. On GBU, it really became a collector's item really fast, so you still see those pop up on eBay for really absurdly high dollar amounts. So if you love the slipcovers, you will have to order sooner rather than later. But this is the same art design as their original release. And then we get the case using the black 4K UHD casing. Same art with the standard Kino style. Again, this is all very similar to their original release. Then you open the case and it's just two standard Kino discs inside, the 4K UHD, and then which only has the commentaries on it, and then the Blu-ray, which has all of the extras on it. So let's just get into this. This disc is pretty much a slight upgrade and reworking of Kino's previous disc, which was from a brand new 4K scan handled at Retrovada, just like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was. And unfortunately, it was hit with an appallingly bad color grading job, just like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Not quite as bad in some areas, but still looking nothing like what it should, which was also very strange because the film had gotten a 2007 Italian restoration done, funded partially by Ripley Home Video, who released the Italian Blu-ray of it, and that produced a really lovely new restoration master, which largely had accurate color and nice detail and looked really nice. I've actually seen a 35mm print of that restoration, which I remember looking better than any of the home versions so far. It's not 100% perfect. It was done at 2K instead of 4K. It was done back in 2007. So this restoration, this 4K scan could advance beyond that, but it was already an impressive thing to start from. And unfortunately, the color of the previous Kino release was so bad that it really made the older 2007 restoration look all that much better. So I didn't purchase or really bother with the previous Kino disc because it only had one or two new extras, which I would love to see, which are on this release. So now I've finally seen those. But otherwise, it was just terrible color, and I didn't want to go through the whole GBU thing again. And this was in the aftermath of their Kino's 2017 GBU release with the terrible color and the not very good attempt to fix the color, which made it even worse, and then the sort of backlash against the fan community, and it was just a whole bunch of nastiness, and I was just sort of tired of the whole thing, so I didn't even I never purchased the initial Kino Lorber Blu-ray releases of either A Fistful of Dollars or For a Few Dollars More, and For a Few Dollars More was actually a pretty decent transfer from what I heard, but also Kino announced they would be looking at doing a box set or 4K releases very soon, so that was another reason why I decided to hold off, and it just took until now when they decided to do them as standalones. So I am glad that I waited, and there is no reason to have the previous Kino disc because I think it's unwatchable due to the color, for one thing. But to talk about the picture transfer of this release and how it compares to all the previous versions, again, this is from a 4K scan, and they actually credit with their little blurb. Unfortunately, Kino never goes into detail about the restoration work, but we do get a little blurb talking about the extensive shot-by-shot color grading of the logarithmic restored 4K files provided by Leone and Retrovada. So what you can take from this is that there was color grading redone to the 4K master, but instead of using the same master file they'd already been provided or a compressed one, they actually went and got more of, I guess what you would say, a lossless file version of the master itself to work directly from, as opposed to working to color correct a compressed master they were sent. You can look at comparison pictures online or on Capsaholic, for example, to look at what the old disc looked like. And again, the old disc was terrible in its color, and it is really impressive what they were able to do in recovering a lot of the original color. So there are sequences here that look really excellent. There are some shots and sequences that I think actually improve upon the 2007 Italian master, which had a really great look overall, but I always thought the skin tones were a little bit reddish. And another big problem is Fistful has a number of day for night sequences, and on all the US prints and the US release versions that MGM used on all their video releases, that those sequences were pretty much left without any darkening of the image, or they were a little bit dark, but they didn't have any color tinting or any filtering on them. And then the Italian version in the restoration went for a hard, dark, very dark blue where you could barely even see people at certain points in the day for night sequences. And it always seemed like those were a bit too dark, because there are some scenes in that where you can't see anything. You just see the faint outline of someone's face or their hand. So those are handled a little bit better in certain places than the Italian restoration did in 2007 that you get on the Ripley home video release, and you also get on the German release I have behind me, which is a port of that master. Now, those are the plus sides. On the negatives, there are frequently moments where you see bits of that original color timing, unfortunately, poking its way through. So there are some shots that still look a bit greenish or brownish where they shouldn't. The problem with Fistful's color grading was that it went for this sort of greenish cast instead of the sort of amber yellow cast that the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly got applied to it on the terrible color master. So unfortunately, there are bits that poke through that look like the older, the master itself, I should say. And unfortunately, it's such a mixed bag that the negatives really do outweigh the positives. So again, there are some pieces that look better than the 2007 Italian restoration and other versions. Then there are frequently other scenes that look worse in the color timing. It is, again, impressive what they could do in fixing the master, but again, like the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, what they really needed to do was to just start fresh because the master itself was compromised. It's not quite as bad as what happened on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but this also didn't have the same intensive study of reference materials that their GBU revisit disc did. As far as I'm aware, this did not have any fan participation, and I don't know anything about the restoration process. Again, this seems like just a regraded version of the master they previously released on their original Blu-ray disc. So that is unfortunate, because had those efforts been taken, we could have had something very similar to their GBU disc for this Ritrovata 4K master of A Fistful of Dollars. So it's problematic in its color timing. You'll also notice if you have the either the Italian Blu-ray or the German Blu-ray that there is some cropping of the image going on here. Nothing too terribly substantial, but it is a definite amount of cropping, almost like the image has sort of been recentered slightly. That was also very interesting and odd to see. That is something for those purchasers who are really big on trying to not have any cropping of images, or who are very sensitive to things like that. You will notice that, and again, particularly if you have either the old Italian or German Blu-rays. Also, the encoding is it's okay, but it's also not image-wise the quantum leap forward you would think, being a 4K scan versus the older 2K master from the Italian restorations. While this does have an uptick in detail on for the most part, there are sequences where they kind of look almost the same, if not the Italian version actually looks better, whether you have it on the Italian or German Blu-rays. So again, I'm not exactly sure what happened, but it's not the sort of visual upgrade that I expected it to be in terms of, this wiping the floor with previous releases in terms of detail across the board. It does in certain areas, but not all of them. So that's another reason why I think this is a problematic release in terms of its video content. I'll also say I did spot I spotted one hair that was visible in the frame. I didn't see any others, but that was also a little disconcerting to see in a 4K restoration. I will say that also in the day for night shootout between the Rojos and the Baxters in the graveyard, there is a particular scene that does have in-camera negative scratches on it. That's always been a part of the film. Different restorations have tried to cover that up. MGM removed it from their versions, and then the Italian restoration was so dark that you couldn't even see it anyway. Here, it has mostly been removed, but it is still there a little bit in the lower left-hand corner. It's when Ramon is jumping back over the rock to rejoin his brothers in the shootout in the cemetery. But that was interesting to note. And it might be that just because this is not timed as dark as the Italian restoration was, and you can actually see where people are, sort of, that you can see the little trails of those left. But that was interesting to note that those were still there in some form. I'll also say the opening and closing titles are the original US United Artists titles, and the opening titles actually are a mix. They have some of the pseudonym credits, but Leone has his director's credit restored. But it does have the U.S. United Artist end title card on there, which not all releases do. So unfortunately, I can't say this is it's going to be an upgrade in visual terms that people are going to have to really think about if you're a fan of the film and you have a bunch of other releases, or you're trying to figure out which release to get. Unfortunately, this is not a slam dunk in terms of picture. It does have a number of issues of its own, but in some instances, like the skin tones and some scenes and the day for night shots, I do think there's improvement there. I do think some sequences do look really nice and impressive, but unfortunately there are others that, due to the original master's color timing, you do have some of that still there. There are some crushed blacks here and there. So I hate to say it, but you do have to basically pick and choose between this and the original Italian restoration. And since the German version is region-free and easily available, I do think if you want this film in HD in the best possible form, I do think you kind of need to actually have both. There are improvements here in the Kino release over the German and Italian Blu-rays, and especially the old MGM Blu-ray, which was based on their interpositive sources and a really old master with a lot of issues. This technically should be the best version, but it isn't. It does have drawbacks of its own. So again, it's going to be up to each individual purchaser and each individual Leone fan to decide if this is going to be enough to warrant an upgrade in terms of the picture. So unfortunately, this is not a big leap forward across the board in terms of picture quality. It does have some inherent issues. The color grading does make some significant fixes and tweaks, which were sorely needed. It still can't fix everything, and unfortunately this is not a case like the Kino 4K of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where they really tried to get it as good as humanly possible by using dye transfer Technicolor frames for reference and reconstructing the 1967 international cut. This is pretty much their previous disc with a new color grading. Now, that would all be one thing in terms of the picture if that was all we had to talk about and everything else was solid. However, I do think there is a deal breaker here, and that's actually in the audio realm. This is something that's not publicized or talked about. This disc carries what is labeled a 2.0 mono mix and a 5.1 mix. And apparently this is the same audio that was on the previous Kino disc, but since I never picked that up, this was my first experience with this audio track. And this is tied to this restoration, which did have some backing by the Film Foundation, but was handled primarily in Italy, I believe, at Ritrovata as well. MGM also provided some elements, and there is a little paragraph blurb about the restoration of the audio in the notes about the restoration itself. And when you read through that, it sounds great and fine, like they used optical track elements and masters and reconstructed the original mono mix. Again, all that sounds fine and dandy, but when you actually put this disc in, especially if you know this film very well and you know how Leone put so much intricate work and focus into the sound design of all of his films, even though they were still mono, this is... Personally, I think this audio is appalling. I think that's the best word to describe this. They completely messed up the levels and the balance of the mix itself. So even though it is still technically mono, what they did seemingly was go and pull soundtrack master elements, and the music overwhelms everything else every time it comes up in the film. It is a very jarring experience. It overshadows the dialogue, the effects. Frequently things are drowned out, and honestly, the actual editing and the placement of the music cues isn't quite right either. The fade outs are not there. There are portions of the effects and the dialogue that are not just obscure, but there are at least one or two things I'm aware of currently that are missing, and I really need to sit down and just do a straight comparison and rewatch the whole film with two copies going at the same time, because it's that level of bad. This was an extremely frustrating watch experience because I had to keep stopping the movie every 2 seconds, it felt like, and be like, did I hear that correctly? And rewind and go back. Admittedly, I've seen the film many, many, many times on many formats and theatrically, so I know it extremely well, and I also know what MGM did with their 5.1 remixes, which, even when they expanded into 6 channels and added a few effects here and there, they didn't mess with the balance of the mix itself. So even though a lot of later releases, when they claimed to have the mono and really carried a fold down of MGM's 5.1 mix, they still sounded pretty much like the film and like the film's mono track had always sounded in terms of the mix levels itself. Here you don't even get that anymore, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The 5.1 is really just an upmix of this new mono track. It has the same problems. The levels are a little bit different because it's expanded to 6 channels, but it is the same extremely unfortunate track. I personally don't know what went wrong here or how the process went, but it feels like something definitely went wrong. I could tell in the opening title sequence when all of the gunshots were just completely drowned out. All the gunshots and the horse hoofbeat sound effects that are supposed to be really loud in the mix with the iconic Totoli title theme of Morricone's, they were almost inaudible, and then the rest of the film continued that way. And also things were obscured. Even the gunshots felt clipped off and obscured. The first iconic duel, the sensitive mule duel, the iconic gunshots of the Man with No Name are, the first gunshots you hear in the film of the Man with No Name are slightly obscured, and there's even a little bit of editing there in the soundtrack that is not carried over in this new supposed restoration remix. And it is a remix. It's just labeled mono, but this is a straight up remix with all the problems a remix can entail, and I think it's extremely distracting, and I've seen a lot of people giving praise to this new track and not finding any issues with it, which I found extremely disconcerting when I was just like stopping every 2 seconds and rewinding and going, wait, did I hear that correctly? Because I thought I was hearing things. I think it is much more revealing of itself if you have a better sound system, or especially if you have really good bookshelf speakers or full range tower speakers, or even a really good pair of headphones. It is It's really obvious in a good home theater setup, but it is painfully, excruciatingly obvious with a good pair of headphones, especially when you're plugged into your receiver. If you know this film very well, if you're a big Leone fan, and especially if you already, like me, pay attention to the audio mixes on disc and how they frequently have problems, this will drive you up the wall. This will make you tear your hair out. And personally, even though on the surface it's not as obvious as some of the stuff that MGM did with their remixes, I think it's worse. I do think this is the worst audio the film has ever had on disc. I think something went painfully wrong here. Again, there are at least several instances I am aware of currently at the time of recording this video that are not correct and do not match the original sound design intended by Sergio Leone, that you can directly compare to all previous releases to the Kino versions where this audio showed up for the first time. And you can compare and actually see the difference, I should say, hear the difference for yourself. So, unfortunately, I cannot recommend this disc for the audio. The audio is the deal breaker for me because it is that bad when properly examined. The levels are completely shot in terms of the levels and balance between the music, the dialogue, and effects. And again, some of the dialogue and effects are drowned out or obscured or actually missing. The actual sound design is not 100% recreated in this supposed restoration mix. Again, I would like to think that something somehow went wrong and it just didn't get caught, but I just couldn't believe what I was hearing from a supposed restoration audio mix. The music sounds great. There's a clarity there because they're coming from some sort of master tape material, but it does not fit a 1964 mono film mix for an Italian Western. It does not sound like A Fistful of Dollars anymore. And that's talking about not just the English mono, but the original Italian mono mix as well. They have limited fidelity, of course, but if you're going to restore this film's audio, you have to make sure that you recreate the original mix balance, and they did not do that here. So it is an extremely jarring experience watching this, and I absolutely have to discourage people from this release simply due to the severe problems of the audio mix. And again, I don't know why this happened, but it is appalling when you examine it closely. And I again, it's not just because I went back and I listened to the track on headphones as well. I could tell something was terribly wrong in the opening title sequence because the balance was just shot. And again, it remained that way for the entirety of the feature. So, as I said, the Picture Master does have issues of its own. It's not perfect, and the color regrading, while it fixes some things, it can't fix other things, and there are some cropping issues and things like that. All that goes out the window. The audio is the gigantic problem here because I think the audio makes this disc absolutely unwatchable. I think it is a terrible disservice to the original sound design of the film, and I do think this is the worst sounding version of the film that has ever been on home video to my personal knowledge and experience, simply because the experience is ruined. Again, I think the down mix mono of the MGM 5.1 mix that was on all of their later releases and their Blu-ray is a better listening experience than the restored mono track found on the Kino releases. So, honestly, if I'd had the previous Kino release, I would have said that that was the worst release of the film ever because it had the terrible audio plus the horrible color grading. This at least doesn't have the horrible color grading to that same extent due to the work Kino did. But again, it still has problems of its own. And this audio is so atrocious that I for the audio alone, I cannot recommend this disc. So I do think this is sort of a patchwork affair where you have to figure out if you want to add it to your collection for various reasons. Some people won't have the same problems with the audio that I have. I know that's already being discussed in various forums, and I've not seen anybody else really get into the audio realm. There have been people who have praised the disc for its audio, which I really find hard to believe because when you examine this track, and if you're a great fan of this film, it is painfully obvious how off this track feels. It feels wrong. The mix balance is totally gone, and it really ruins the experience of looking at a new transfer of A Fistful of Dollars. So again, the audio is the absolute deal breaker, and the 5.1 is merely an upmix of this new flawed restoration track. Now, if you ask, where do you find the best original mono source? Well, I went back to the well, as it were, and looked at all my copies again and did a closer study. And what I hadn't realized is actually, as I've alluded to before, a lot of the later MGM releases merely downmix their 6-channel 5.1 remix of the film. MGM wound up doing this a lot and did it on most of their later Leone releases and just simply called it a mono track. And that, unfortunately, also goes for the German Blu-ray. If you look at the English mono there, it's that same down-mixed MGM track. But then you go to the MGM releases on Blu-ray, and it's the same thing there if it has a mono track at all. Now, I've never owned the Ripley Italian Blu-ray, which does have a version of the English mono, but I have been told by reliable sources, and the great friend of this channel, the Bad Audio on Blu-ray blog, known as bluray.com, did a write-up on Fistful of Dollars as well, and they were able to ascertain that it uses the English mono, but it has some incorrect music cues, and it has some portions that don't sound very good, and it also has a number of audio defects throughout the whole track, which makes it a compromised listening experience itself. So the last major release that is easily available here in the US that has the original mono track is actually the original DVD here with the final VHS cover art. There are versions of this that they're mostly flipper discs with a pan and scan version on one side. This is unfortunately non-anamorphic, and it's basically an upgrade of the old letterbox Laserdisc, but it doesn't have the noise reduction levels that the 1991 Laserdisc had, unfortunately. So it is a little bit better, even though it's a lossy Dolby Digital mono track. But this was the last time the original English mono mix of A Fistful of Dollars was released on home video here in the US. However, it is not the best sounding version. None of the modern versions are. You actually have to go back a ways, and even further beyond going past the early 90s Laserdisc release. If you want to find the best sounding version of the English mono, unfortunately, you do have to go back quite a ways, and you have to do quite a bit of work instead of just using a single source. So you have to actually go all the way back to the original analog audio pan and scan release on the 1985 CBS Fox Laserdisc that I have here. Or you can go to the rough equivalent on the 1984 CBS Fox VHS tape, which has hi-fi audio. The original release was in a slip-out box in 1983, which didn't have hi-fi, which is very common for 20th Century Fox, and then transitioning over to their CBS Fox label. Now, VHS Hi-Fi technically is superior to Laserdisc analog, but unfortunately this is one of the cases where when you look at the VHS tape, and I actually did go and order a copy of this from eBay, and thankfully this was in good shape, unfortunately the audio has been slightly processed some, so it doesn't sound as good as the Laserdisc analog. So again, even though the VHS is technically superior due to its hi-fi audio, the LD is actually preferable. And I don't have both editions of the original for a few dollars more, but I would assume, since Fistful is this way, that the for a few dollars more pan and scan LD is probably going to be better than the VHS tape. And I do intend on doing a video history overview of the Dollars films in the near future on this channel, but this is just one of those cases where you have to look at multiple versions, and unfortunately, like I've encountered a few other times, the VHS is not always going to be superior to the Laserdisc analog track, even though technically it should. Now, in using this source, it's also not a case where you can just copy the analog track of this release and then try and resync it to a modern release, because of course this print is incomplete that they use. So not only is it pan and scan, not only is it analog audio only, but the print itself has a number of things missing. There are little shots and brief snippets that are not there, and so I have to wonder if maybe this was due to it being a slightly censored print, which did happen a lot with these films, or it just being a cobbled together print of different sources that wound up getting damaged damaged or getting things removed or lost over the years, which also happened. And of course, what would any Leone release be without problems? Because they all have problems, because they have to have problems, because they're somehow cursed on home video. So if you go through this, you will notice a bunch of little things missing, and it totals to about a minute or two of footage. So you will have to patch those in from other sources, like the MGM first DVD release, for example. It is not a perfect source, but it is without doubt the best sounding version of the English mono that I'm currently aware of. It doesn't have any heavy-handed noise reduction applied to it. It does have intrinsic noise due to the source, but that's to be expected. And it is unbelievable to me that the best sounding version of the original English mono of this film is all the way back on this 1985 Laserdisc analog track, but unfortunately that's just how it goes. Now, I have tried most every release of the film. I haven't tried all of the various Japanese releases because usually they follow suit with the US releases, and they're also incredibly rare and very expensive, especially because you usually have to import a lot of those. So I've only been able to try what's been available here in the US or what's popped up for cheap. But again, I don't know if it's really going to be worth much because for the most part they do follow in tandem with the US releases. The one major release I haven't tried yet is actually the final analog VHS tape release that MGM did, and I say that because it was the last time they released the film before making their new digital widescreen Laserdisc Video Master and using that for successive VHS releases. So that would be the 1988 and 1991 repackaging VHS tape of A Fistful of Dollars. And the same goes for the sequel for a few dollars more. So those are primarily the last releases I need to check. It's possible they have a better encoding of this same analog track, and so they might be a good source, but it's also possible that they were further messed with or could somehow be a version of the later Laserdisc Master without it being credited. You just have to go and check stuff. There's no way to know anything until you buy yet another copy of the film, and you think you're crazy for buying VHS tapes on eBay again, but that's just unfortunately where I'm at with these films. So again, I do hope and plan on doing a Dollars Trilogy home video history once I check a few more different copies, and I will be able to talk in greater detail about the audio tracks and transfer history of all three films. It is very confusing because this stuff isn't really documented, and there's a lot of early video release variations and different labels, and especially it's really difficult to find the original release copies before, even before CBS Fox had taken over doing the films in the early to mid 1980s. But as it stands, as far as I'm aware, the best sounding version of this film in its original English mono is unfortunately the 1985 analog track on this Pan and Scan Laserdisc release. Another thing to mention, for some strange reason, the very last line of dialogue you hear from the Coffin Maker is in Italian on this release, and my guess is that they had to mix in a portion of an Italian print, and that was actually very common in the early days of these films getting transfers. They would mix and match print sources, which then would introduce various errors in the editing, as happened on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and would later happen on For a Few Dollars More several times, and that caused that film to have video issues up until the present day for the most part. But that's why, for example, on the initial letterbox release of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the iconic freeze-frame character captions where they would spell out The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly are in Italian. So if you ever watched the old Laserdisc releases or VHS tape releases of GBU, you would see that the iconic character captions are in Italian. So it's not uncommon to have mix and match prints, but they usually didn't all of a sudden have a spattering of Italian. So at the very end of this, it goes over into the Italian mix, so that's another one of the little segments you would have to replace with another source of the English mono. Again, probably the DVD is going to be the best bet for mixing and matching sources. But again, as it stands, this is the best sounding release of the original English mono that I am currently aware of, and that's the situation with the film's audio track, unfortunately. There's the back. So that covers the audio portion, which is the most unfortunate part of this new disc, but is no real surprise to Leone enthusiasts because there is no perfect release of any Leone film, and at this point they really seem cursed in terms of every release having some sort of problem, and it seems like we can never get this quite right. But moving on to the extras, Kino does again port over all of the legacy MGM extras, which are quite extensive. They really took off for the special edition DVD, which I have here, which came out in 2007. Those were ported over to the Blu-ray, which added a few little extra bits as well. All of this stuff is ported over. Most of it is in standard definition, and it is thankfully in the correct frame rate, which was a big issue with Kino's 2017 first release of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. However, some of that does rear its ugly head once more, because when you get to the trailer gallery, even though it's a mixture of HD and standard definition trailers, unfortunately most of all the trailers do have the frame rate issue. So it is once again the same sort of slow-mo vision. I think it's like supposedly they're encoded at like 15 frames per second or something, but they have the herky-jerky slow-mo feel and they move like this, and it amazes me that they have made it on somehow to every Kino release of the Leone films. So unfortunately, if you're like me and you really love looking at the original trailers and all the different Italian and US trailers that are on the video releases for the Leone films, you do have to deal with that for the trailers here. So unfortunately, those have not gotten corrected still. But the actual extras and featurettes themselves are fine, thankfully. But if you're looking for, does anything have the frame rate issue? Well, the trailers still do, unfortunately. Now, the MGM extras themselves were excellent, including the discovery and restoration of the network prologue for television that was shot for this film, which is a fantastic curio and oddity, and amazing it survived. And that was shot by Monty Hellman, and they did a little interview with him, and it's one of the many great extras, including the sit-down with Clint Eastwood, who talked a little bit about each film. And these were made in 2003, 2004, when the GBU expanded version was made, and we had to wait to get them on disc until 2007 due to MGM's bankruptcy issues. I still remember waiting for these extras with bated breath because I was a strange teenager who just wanted more Leone special editions and had to wait a few more years. But the main draw of this are the new custom Kino extras that were also on their previous Blu-ray, and the two commentaries, one of which is the exclusive part I was mentioning. So the two commentaries, we have the amazing Sir Christopher Frayling doing a commentary on the film that was on the MGM releases. Frayling on Leone is a match made in heaven. He, of course, is the world's greatest expert on Leone's work. He wrote the definitive biography on Leone, Something to Do with Death, and many other books on Leone, and is in many different interviews and other books as well. But to have him sit down and just talk you through A Fistful of Dollars is, worth the cost of admission alone, and that's essential to be ported over. It's the best and most important of the MGM extras, so that has been carried over. And then Kino had commissioned the great Tim Lucas to do a commentary. He's done one on all of the Dollars films now for Kino, so that is exclusive to the Kino releases. That itself is an absolutely excellent track, and it makes a fantastic double pairing with Frayling's commentary being ported over. So it's one of the reasons why I think that all Leone fans will have to get a copy of this, even though it is still problematic, because it's a great commentary track. It's not simply repeating what Frayling went over. It's a great secondary track of its own, and they really complement each other beautifully. I think it goes hand in hand with the great track Lucas did for Kino's GBU release. So that is the one of the essential exclusive extras to the Kino release. The other is an outstanding, and of course that goes without saying because this is a Mike Siegel produced and directed interview. Mike Siegel is the genius documentary filmmaker behind the phenomenal Sam Peckinpah Passion and Poetry documentary and other documentaries he's made about Peckinpah films. He's done many other things, but that's what he's most well known for. But he has an incredible talent for interviews with cast and crew members that really get to the heart of their experiences, and also have this innate sense of being in the room with the person, and they let their guard down and just talk openly. And he does this in this wonderful sit-down interview with Marianne Koch, who was, of course, Marisol in the film, and it is a nice, meaty 30-plus minute interview, and once it's over, you don't want it to end. It is beautifully put together, and you really get to feel like you know this person, as in all of Mike Siegel's interview and documentary pieces. It is such a wonderful thing for Leone fans that I think that, combined with the Tim Lucas commentary, make this still worth the purchase, because as a Leone fan, you're going to buy this anyway, just as I knew I was going to buy it anyway. These were previously on the Kino release before this, but since I skipped that, it was great to finally experience them here. They are phenomenal extras, but of course it goes without saying, if Mike Siegel does a documentary, especially on something within the Western genre, yes, it's going to be fantastic, and it absolutely is. So, that and the Tim Lucas commentary, those are highlights. But is also a highlight as well as there is an outtakes reel. It's very short. It's about 2 minutes long, and seemingly it was compiled during the time of making this new restoration. And so you get to see bits of clapperboard being slated footage, and bits of Leone and Eastwood and various cast and crew members on the set, and sort of moving around naturally. And it's, of course, that amazing time capsule type experience. The only problem is it's presented in HD, which is amazing. It's amazing any of this survive, but it has been color timed to be very modern and bright and have deep modern type colors. So that's a little unfortunate, because I'm pretty darn sure that footage did not look like that originally. I wish they would have left the color alone. But still, it's amazing that that's here. And as far as I'm aware, that is only found on these modern Kino releases. I could be wrong. It could be on some other releases. But this was my first time seeing this particular edit of these outtakes. So for me, the main draw of the extras package, because everything else was on the MGM releases, is the Tim Lucas commentary, the amazing Mike Siegel interview, and then that outtakes gallery. So that's Kino Lorber's new 2022 release of A Fistful of Dollars on Blu-ray and SDR 4K UHD. Unfortunately, this is an extremely compromised affair. To say it is a mixed bag is an understatement. While it does have some impressive color regrading work done to the Richard Vada master source files, it can't overcome all of the inherent issues in the master. It does have some visual issues of its own that I do think are a bit of a drawback. And I wish it had had the same level of care and attention put into it in terms of doing extra research and working with fan historians as Kino's 4K release of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly had. That's what we were all hoping for, that the other two films in the Dollars trilogy would receive the same treatment. And unfortunately, that hasn't quite happened here. The real deal breaker for me is the audio. This new restoration mix is really botched. It is truly unfortunate, and again, I think that really makes the film unwatchable. That's not going to be everyone's opinion, but if you are extremely well acquainted with this film, you will notice right off the bat just how distracting it is, and how much it does wreck most of the film experience, unfortunately. Again, that's not going to be everyone's opinion, and especially if you're just watching on a television without a dedicated home theater system or good headphones, it's not going to be very obvious, because it is within a mono container, essentially, because it is still a mono track. But you will notice in any case that the music completely overpowers everything else, which is not supposed to do. It's supposed to work with it, not totally just consume it. So for me, the audio is a complete deal breaker, but there are some fantastic and exclusive essential extras that make this still important to purchase for Leone fans and completists like myself. So again, it is a complete mixed bag. It is not going to be for everyone, and it is not the definitive upgrade everybody was hoping for. So I can't point to this like I can Kino's GBU 4K release and say to people, you can buy this and it's a one and done situation. It has vastly improved picture, and it has the correct edit, and it has all the old extras, and it has the best presentation of the English mono available. It ticks all the boxes. It's not perfect, but it is the best release that I can point to, and you don't have to have a whole bunch of other releases. Well, with Fistful, you still have to have a whole bunch of other releases, unfortunately. I do think you need to, if you get this, you do need to have a version of the previous Italian restoration. Again, it's very easy to pick up the German Blu-ray, which is region-free, and use that to complement this release, because even though that's an older Blu-ray and an older master, visually it does do a lot of things better than the new version does. But then there's some pieces of the new master that do better than the previous Italian restoration, and none of them have a really good audio track. So again, in terms of the audio, you're just sort of, you have to pick and choose unless you go the route like I did of getting a bunch of old releases and comparing them, and then you have to cobble together your own reconstructed English mono track, because you have to do this work yourself sometimes. If you want the easiest method of getting the original English mono, you can get the original MGM DVD for nothing these days, and that does have a good sounding version of the English mono. It's not the best sounding version, but it is good. It is better than the previous Laserdisc release from the early 90s, and it is readily available, and you can easily find it for, maybe $1 or $2, if not even less. But if you do want the absolute best sounding audio that is known to exist on home video, you have to go back to the old CBS Fox releases and cobble together your own English mono track with other sources filling in the gaps that are in this print that was used. Rubio! So that is Kino's Blu-ray 4K UHD combo pack of A Fistful of Dollars, and it is unfortunately an extremely compromised release that it pains me to say that, because I was really hoping this would be a complete improvement like Kino's 4K The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was. So I can't recommend this, and I can't say that this is a upgrade over previous versions. It's going to be up to each individual purchaser, Leone fan, or Blu-ray enthusiast to decide whether they want to add this to their collection for themselves. It is rather inexpensive, and it is going to be on Kino's site and included in their various sales. So this might be a title you might want to wait till it goes on sale. But of course, slipcover fans are already worrying about being able to get a copy with the slipcover, because this is a big seller, and like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the two new releases of the Dollars films will very quickly sell out of their slipcovers. So if that is a factor for you, you do want to go ahead and purchase this, because otherwise you will just have the standard release version without the nice slipcover. So with that, I just want to say, if you have any questions or further comments about this new release, or if you've picked it up yourself and have your own findings, I would love to hear about them in the comments below. I hope this has been informative and at least somewhat helpful if you were sort of on the fence about picking up this new Kino release. I'm sorry to report bad news, but it is definitely a mixed bag, and it will be up to each individual purchaser whether it will be something you want to add to your Leone shelf or not. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.
The Italian and German Blu-rays on one side, maybe the Kino on the other, me right in the middle. Too dangerous. So long.
Is actually going all the way back to... I knew that was going to happen. I knew it.